Well, Kenzie, thank you very much. That was a very well thought out and very appropriate discussion for what's been going on these last month here in the Southern High Plains. We do have a couple questions in the Q&A, so I am going to respond to them, and so you can share your insights on that.
For sure.
So the first question is, and I'll sort of paraphrase it because there's a couple points on it. How do you choose who gets the survey, and was the survey nationwide or in Tornado Alley?
Great question. Thanks for asking that. So we use a platform called Qualtrics, and you basically, to get surveys like this, you sign up with Qualtrics to be a survey respondent, and then Qualtrics will send you different surveys based on what types of respondents we're looking for. And the second part of the question, our sample is representative of the US population, so it's the entire nation. And we make sure that it's representative with a couple different characteristics, age, region, race, gender, ethnicity, and one more that I can't pull off the top of my head right now, but it's representative generally of the population.
So just a couple things for clarification. You may want to explain what Qualtrics is. That's question number one. And then the other, where do you get the list from?
So Qualtrics is basically, they're a company that collects, like, makes sure they keep a whole list of people who want to take surveys. And then universities and research institutions will go and use Qualtrics to help get that survey sent out to a bunch of people. So you might not know that, you're signing up to take surveys with Qualtrics, but it's one of the main companies that does that. And then the second part of your question.
Oh, the second part of the question is so you answered, the list comes from Qualtrics, correct?
Yes. Okay. Yep. The respondents come from Qualtrics. That's exactly right.
Okay. Let's go to our next question. Is the public asking for updates? Do they care, or are they satisfied with the current alert system?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I think it really depends. I mean, I think if you are really weather savvy, then you're kind of always wanting more information. And so that's sort of one of the goals of what's called the Forecasting a Continuum of Environmental Threats, or FACETS. It's a big acronym that basically means the National Weather Service is trying to change their current severe weather notification system to be more continuous. So instead of, here's a watch, wait, oh, here's a warning. They're trying to make that system more continuous so that you're constantly getting information as the weather changes. So there are some people who certainly want that. Emergency managers, people who manage hospitals and schools who really need to stay up to date, really want that. Other people are probably really satisfied or probably don't want as much information as they're getting right now.
Well, and that really raises the question, and some of your data show this. There's been a lot of work done with how people look at risk.
Yeah.
How do people assess risk? And so while you had a graph that looks at how the different age groups look at information, I'm sure there's a corresponding graph that looks at how people of different ages assess risk and whether that risk is going to affect them. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, certainly. So there are people who are more risk averse and people who are more risk accepting. And there's a lot of different factors that go into sort of how risk averse or not you are. The COVID-19 pandemic has showed me that I am personally very risk averse. So I don't like to accept a lot of risk. That's just kind of who I am as a person. But other people are kind of the exact opposite, especially with weather events. They're, okay taking that risk and maybe, not cleaning out their shelter right away because they know reality is you're not going to use that shelter very often. I've been in it once and we've had it 4 years. So certainly with age is one of the factors that goes into sort of how risk accepting or risk averse you are. Also, just from a personal standpoint, when I decided to move into a house in Oklahoma, all of a sudden I was a lot more concerned about the weather than when I was living in an apartment. So there are a lot of different factors that go into how much risk you're willing to accept.
And so in terms of your communicating the information, is that ever taken into account in terms of how this goes out?
Yeah, we do measure actually. We ask some questions like, how much risk does your area have for tornadoes? How much risk is there for extremely cold weather. We ask a number of different weather hazards, and we use those answers to those questions as some of our very independent variables, some of our variables that help predict whether or not people are going to respond. So what we tend to see is that people who think that tornadoes have a much bigger risk to their area, they tend to respond more to warnings and watches, for example.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yep. Okay, let's get on with the questions in here. So our next question is, how do cultures in developing countries handle severe weather alerts, if you know?
So I don't know a lot about that, but we are actually starting to kind of explore that question with immigrants to the US. And so some of my colleagues are actually looking at that because even just people who move around the country have different awareness of weather hazards, for example. So one of the things that we have studied a little bit more is people who live mainly up north and then they retire down south in the coastal areas who haven't had any experiences with tropical weather and hurricanes, trying to make sure or at least understand how well they know the risk for hurricanes in that area is really interesting. Because when you grow up in that area, you tend to know the risk pretty well, but when you don't, when you're moving to different areas, that can be kind of a big issue. So I don't know too much about other countries yet, but we're getting there.
Okay, very good. Okay, so one of the questions delved on some of your data. In your figures showing how people see warnings separated by generation, I found it interesting that how the number of people who got their warning by broadcast radio did not follow that for those who got it by TV.
Yeah, so I'm just going to pull that figure up for myself so I can see it. There it is. Yeah, so it looks like, so TV obviously had that really big slope down, but then broadcast radio, oh yeah, that's one of the really interesting ones. That one shows that basically Gen X and millennial generations are using broadcast radio a lot more than the other generations. But then that trend doesn't hold for Gen Zs, for the youngest generation. So I'm not really sure why that's occurring. I have an idea that maybe some people aren't understanding what broadcast radio versus weather radio are. I know that when you say broadcast radio, I'm kind of like, you mean like the radio in my car? You know, so that might be part of that there. But that's a really good point. I wouldn't expect to see younger generations using broadcast radio more than older generations. So
yeah, and I know for here in Lubbock and for Iran, when there is a weather alert, depending upon how you set up your phone, it'll come on our TV also, right? So if you have your TV on at midnight, it's going to broadcast that weather warning.
Yes, that's true. And so you start to see these sources almost blending together and being kind of one with each other. So trying to separate out where you really got that first notification from is sometimes really challenging.
So I'm going to make a suggestion because we have an issue in our house.
Yeah.
The Amber alerts in Texas use the same system. And so I'm sure they do in other places too. So the system is always going off, and our dogs have learned that when that alarm goes off, they run for the bathrooms, yes, right, to hide because they can't tell whether it's a weather alert, and they realize it for the weather because it's usually associated with thunder, which they don't like. And so I'm wondering whether it's fatigue also in terms of how people respond to some of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was thinking too. My pets respond in the same way when they hear either the weather radio go off or the sirens outside. You can actually hear in our house. When they hear either one of those, they immediately run for under the bed. Right. And so for us, we need to make those decisions earlier in the day. We actually need to like close all the bedroom doors to make sure that they don't run under the bed when they hear the warning. So it's certainly, a lot of it has to do with fatigue. I see a lot of this on Twitter where people are like, you know, how do I turn off the emergency notifications on my phone? Because they go off for the Amber alerts and then they don't get the weather alerts. Right. So some of that has changed recently. I know for some carriers, you can actually separate the Amber alert and the weather alert, but not all. So it's...
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay, here's our next question. Do you study the types of shelters that are the most protective, or are you focused on forecast only? Can you give some input on that?
Yeah, no, we don't do a whole lot with like structural integrity of shelters. That's actually more of a TTU thing.
Yes, it is.
So we don't do a lot with that. We are a little bit more focused on, do you even shelter in the first place?
Okay. Yep. So one of the questions I have, and I don't know, I'm sure it's come up. One of the issues that and I didn't realize this until one of my students in one of my classes was talking about this. How does the notification system in terms of color deal with people who are colorblind? Because there is a large portion of the population that's red, green colorblind.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is I'm sure most of you have seen it for the radar velocity, where you have the red next to the green, that usually means tornado occurring. There are even some NWS forecasters who switch that to blue-orange because of the red-green colorblind issue. It's an issue. It's definitely an issue, and it's something that we've played with a little bit. One of my colleagues is very colorblind, and so this is something that we talk about a lot, but it hasn't been super formally addressed in, like, especially the reflectivity warning, which is green often, and then you have the red tornado warning on top.
Yeah, so it just makes it more difficult. Yes,
it does.
It does. Okay, so here's our next question. Let's see here. Let me answer this, get this done. Is there an emerging consensus on when to put effort in surveying, understanding, and designing around human response, and when to firm up a messaging approach and put effort into changing understanding and response through education? Where's, how do you focus those efforts?
So it's a good question. It's a hard question. Our job, mainly what we do, is try to understand. And so we are really focused on the data collection, which I think is mostly where we're still at, to be honest. The world of trying to understand how people use weather information is still pretty young. Meteorology as a field isn't a super old field either, but it's been around a lot longer than sort of the social science and meteorology field has. And so I think we're still pretty firmly in the gathering data and trying to build a baseline of knowledge before we make changes. And that's really important because, especially like with the Storm Prediction Center scale that I showed, where we have some data that says people like to switch the order of the words. What's really important is that we make one change, and it's a really good one change, because the last thing we want to do is make a change and then be like, oh, I guess that one didn't work either. So every time we make a change, there's this new learning curve. People have to learn a new system. And it's really important that we only do that once and make sure that we do it right. So I think as for right now, we're still firmly in the understanding phase and the surveying phase.
So let me ask you a question, and that raises an interesting, and I hadn't thought about this until you were mentioning this. When people do put on, and maybe you did answer some of the survey, I just didn't catch it. What proportion of the population simply ignores all this?
Yeah. It's a good question. For warnings, most people, at least most people say that they pay attention to warnings.
Okay.
Probably somewhere over 80% of people say that.
Okay.
What is interesting, though, is that when you ask about a hypothetical situation, so let's say hypothetically you're going to get a warning next week, do you think you would get it? People are much more confident in their abilities when it's a hypothetical situation than if you were to go and say, this tornado came through here last week, when you have a real event. When you ask people, did you get the warning there? The proportion of people who say yes is actually lower than when you're asking about a hypothetical situation. So again, people have really good intentions, but when you're in a real life scenario, what if you're in the middle of a really big meeting and you get the tornado warning? Sometimes it's really hard to get. So.
Right. Yeah. So let me ask you the other question that raises that comes up is, could you restate the period of time between when a warning is given and how much actual time you might have?
Yeah, so for a warning, generally you have somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes, generally. Sometimes it's less than that, sometimes it's more. But when you get a warning, it's you got to make a pretty immediate decision. You don't have a whole lot of time to go and make sure the cats are not under the bed.
Right. And there's no aspects of Doppler or anything that allows you to see where that vortex might form.
That's actually, so my husband's a meteorologist and he actually does that part. I do the what do people do with weather information. He does the how do we forecast better part. And they're working on things like how can we predict, we've got two supercells, one north and one south. can we try to understand which one is going to produce a tornado later on?
Right.
There's a lot of people working on that, but as of right now, that's not very reliable.
No, and I know the people here at Tech are trying to do the same thing. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's people are everywhere trying to do it. It would be it'd be really, really helpful to give people, you know, a little bit longer in that warning time frame.
And I wonder if that's the issue that goes on, because obviously for hurricanes, you have days in terms of tracks, but for tornadoes, you have very small. And so the question is, how much of that risk is real or not, depending upon the formation.
For sure, absolutely. And you know, I say it'd be really helpful to give more time, and that's mostly true, but in a system where people are used to only getting 15 minutes, sometimes when you give them, you know, a really, really long amount of time, they're aware of the limitations of the system. And so when you say you're going to get a tornado in 4 to 8 hours, we have a lot of people saying, you can't tell me that. I'm going to wait, and I'm going to wait to see if that's actually true before I do something. Okay. So, you know, it's again, a changing system thing.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, so here's our next question. Due to a changing climate, southern states are expecting extreme heat waves this summer and in future summers. Is this something that we can expect severe weather alerts about in the future?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So right now, the National Weather Service narrowly defines severe weather as tornadoes, wind, and hail. But there are other alerts that, like excessive heat warnings and other alerts that talk about extreme heat. And so those alerts do exist. They're not communicated in the same way that severe weather alerts are. And so that might be something that broadcast meteorologists, emergency managers, the National Weather Service may start talking about more in the future.
Okay, but they're not doing anything like that now.
The alerts are issued. They just may not be communicated or talked about as much.
No, I mean, what's interesting is, you know, Oklahoma and us will get fire weather warnings and fire weather alerts and things like that because of wind and those sorts of things. But it's not on the same. I mean, it's a much more long time period, because you know when the wind's going to crank up across the southern high plains.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is I think tornadoes and severe weather are maybe more exciting to talk about, but extreme heat and extreme cold and flooding, those are actually the weather hazards that harm and kill the most people. So we really should be talking about some of those quote unquote more boring, you know, events more. But for some reason, I think severe weather it brings up these emotions, like these really visceral emotions, and that's why we talk about them so much.
Okay. Interesting. Very good. Okay. So here's another question. How do rural versus urban communities differ in their response to alert systems?
Yeah, so we see it kind of varies. It's a little bit varied, but certainly people's response actions and their intended response actions are really different. So people out in rural communities, actually, a lot of times they have individual storm shelters at their homes. And in urban communities, oftentimes when you live like in apartments and things like that, they won't know exactly where the nearest shelter is. I know when I lived in an apartment, their severe weather plan was for you to go to I lived on an upper floor, and you were supposed to go to a lower floor and hope that your neighbors were home and could let you in, which was a little bit concerning to me. But that's generally, you know, what the main plan is, because.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because I know, you know, we have a farm in rural Wisconsin, and it's the same thing. We get the alerts, but we have an area in this. We have a sub basement specifically for tornadoes, so everybody knows you go down there.
Yep. Yeah, it was a new experience, like, growing up in Minnesota, where we didn't get tornadoes very often, but when we did, it was like, okay, let's just go and hang out in the basement. To here, where you actually have to make quite a few of those decisions. I mean, for my own personal preference, you have to make those decisions earlier on.
Yeah. Okay, here's our next question. When does hurricane season start, and should we be worried about the 2021 hurricane season? What can you say?
Hurricane season generally hurricane season runs from June 1st to November 1st, but you can see hurricanes earlier than that and later than that, which we have in recent years. So we're heading right into the hurricane season here this this year. I have not kept up with the forecasts for this year, so I cannot tell you if it's going to be worse or better.
No, so I like to keep up with meteorology. So
Yes.
the Hurricane Center indicated that this will probably likely be a worse season than last year,
Oof.
with more norms, with more named storms. And I know they're not going to do the Greek alphabet this year.
I did hear that, and I think I heard, was it the Atlantic Basin or the Pacific Basin? One of them, the backup names, like if we go through the whole alphabet, one of the backup names is Hurricane Kenzie, and so that was fun. I don't know that I like that, but that was interesting.
That would be pretty good. Okay. Okay, here's our next question. There have been recent meetings that are starting to address the future of heat stress forecast communication. Perhaps this will come to pass in a few years. And you've mentioned this already, but you know, where is the Weather Service going with some of this?
So I don't know a whole lot about excessive heat warnings, I admit, but I can say that I have heard that they are looking to renew focus on some of the excessive heat warnings and really look at watches, warnings, and advisories, and what those categories are and sort of what the response should be to them. So I know that there are discussions happening with them. I don't know the details, unfortunately.
Okay. So there's a couple other questions. What's been interesting is those of us living in the Southern High Plains have been aware that the tornado belt is moving eastward. Can you speak a little bit about that and what the Storm Prediction Center is looking at as we go forward?
Yeah, so actually my PhD advisor, Harold Brooks, was one of the people who looked into that really recently. And the interesting thing is it's all relative, right? So most tornadoes happen kind of in the Central Plains areas. And so that area has seen a decrease in the number of tornadoes, and the Southeast has started to see an increase in the number of tornadoes. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden tornadoes are going to occur only in the Southeast and not in the Plains. It just means that relative to how many you get, we're seeing a little bit less in the Plains and a little bit more in the Southeast, which is important to know because responses to tornadoes in these two areas is really different. So there's a lot more people living in mobile and manufactured homes in the Southeast, and that creates a larger population that's really vulnerable to tornadoes. So it's really important for forecasters in that area to understand that those people probably need more time to respond because they have to actually get to a shelter.
Yeah, because I know, I mean, ecologically, in the kind of work that I do, I know that, you know, that 100th meridian boundary between the arid west and the mesic east, that's been shifting eastward. So that boundary where these types of these tornadoes would develop is obviously shifting in that direction also.
Interesting.
So the other question too is what can you say about the strength and duration of tornadoes over the last couple decades?
So I don't think that we've really seen a shift in the strength or duration, at least not a really noticeable one. I live really close to Moore, Oklahoma, which has seen quite a few really strong tornadoes recently. And so people tend to say like, well, what's going on with Moore? I think a big part of that is that humans only live for so long. And so we only remember, you know, the 30, 40, 50 years that we've lived in this area. Sure. Whereas if you would plot on a map all the tornadoes that occur in central Oklahoma, Norman and OKC have the same number of lines going over them. It's just Moore has seen a number of them in the past 20 or 30 years. Sure. So it's something to talk about, you know?
Okay. So let's see. So there was a follow-up to an earlier question. How are people able to predict the severity of hurricanes, tornadoes months ahead of time?
We generally can't. So especially tornadoes, we can't predict the strength of a tornado really until it's on the ground, and even really until it's over.
No, but in your WeCot map, you look at the confluence, I guess, of you know, dry lines and weather, and you know, whatever's bringing the weather up in terms of the atmosphere. Yep. So you must be able to have a better understanding of the dynamics that cause supercells to form, yes, and those sorts of processes.
Yes, absolutely. There, we can look at environmental characteristics. So we know that certain environments, that's what the SPC forecasts, right? Certain environments are going to be more likely to produce really high-end tornadoes. You don't often get the really high-end tornadoes in these more marginal, not so great environments. So that can certainly tell us something about the potential strength of tornadoes. But as for like this storm is going to produce an EF5, we can't do that
Yeah,
specifically.
sure. Right, right. So here's another interesting question. This came up in the chat. Um, you touched on rural versus urban community response. How about communities that have been badly impacted by severe weather in the past? Do they respond quicker?
They respond differently. That's really for sure. So after the Moore tornado in 2013, we saw a lot of what we call severe weather anxiety or storm anxiety. And so people were maybe doing things that they didn't really have to. They were, sheltering really early, or they were, going to the grocery store and buying supplies like months in advance of severe weather. So storm anxiety is a real thing, and I think it still exists, especially in communities who were devastated recently by previous storms. So yeah, they certainly respond differently. I don't know, they might respond quicker. I don't know that we can say that for sure, but they certainly
Sure.
respond differently.
Okay. So if there was anything that you would like to talk to the people that are on this presentation about to do differently or to approach it, what would you say?
I think the main thing I would say is when it comes to severe weather, just make sure you know what you're going to do. And so we say this a lot and it seems cliche, but like have that plan ready. And so if it means closing the bedroom doors so that the pets are only in 2 rooms when you need to shelter, make that, a priority. It's really about awareness and making sure that you sort of have thought through the decisions you should make before you have to make them, so that it's sort of less brain power needed when you get that warning or when you get that watch. That tends to help me. I really like lists, and so we have a list of all the things we would grab if we were to go to shelter, so that we don't have to sit there and be like, oh no, did we grab that? Wait, how about this? It's already there.
Yes. No. I remember when I first moved to Lubbock, I said, yeah, I wonder if I'll ever see a tornado. Luckily, I haven't seen one up close. But I remember in the neighborhood where we were living, it was May. I saw this weird cloud, and next thing you know, I heard this. I look up, and there's someone standing on the roof yelling, "There's a tornado coming to the neighborhood!" And that was far off, and they're all flying around parking cars. And I said, "Doesn't matter where you park your car; it's going to be demolished." And so I said, "Okay, what's my list?" We have a storm closet. I put the dog in the storm closet. Got the quilts. Got my wallet. Got my glasses, and then got the cameras to stand outside taking pictures until the hail started coming down. Right? But you're absolutely right. You have to have those list of things that are necessary so you're not running around like a chicken figuring out what you're going to do.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like the hail that we got 2 weeks ago. The number of our neighbors who were like, hail in 5 minutes, where can I park my car?
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. That's never gonna. Yeah, you're never gonna happen unless you plan out for that.
Exactly.
Okay. So we have time for one or two more questions. If anybody on the chat or on the question and answer. Go. So let me ask you a question. So in terms of you're working with where you're at, what would you say to, because I know we get students on this broadcast. What would you like to say to undergraduates or graduate students about working in the facility you're at currently?
Oh yeah, I am really grateful and really lucky to be working where I am. We have a great team of researchers. No matter if you want to do more climate-based studies, or if you want to do more physical science, severe weather studies, or if you want to do more of the social science studies, there's really a lot. Our teams are growing, and there's a lot of opportunities out there. In fact, I just tweeted yesterday that we actually have 2 social science positions open at the National Weather Center right now. So just a plug that it's a great place to work and that there's a lot of really great people. And if anyone ever has any questions about graduate school or about early career, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. Is probably the best way.
Okay, very good. So we have time, I think, for one more question, and then we'll have to close off. But this one's a Lubbock question. It's important. Do you do weather forecasts or alerts for Haboobs?
I don't, but people do.
I know Lubbock's been getting them for sure.
I've never experienced one, but I'm fairly positive the National Weather Service has alerts for them. I've never experienced one, but the pictures always look stunning
Yeah,
of those storms moving in.
yeah, yeah, yeah. We've had more in the last 5 to 6 years than we've had in the previous time I've been in Lubbock. So
Wow,
yeah, it's
that's
been increasing quite a bit, mainly because of how dry we've been over the last 5 to 8 years. Yep. Yeah.
yeah,
Very
certainly
much
that
so.
would do it.
Very much so. Well, we've come to our 6 o'clock hour, and I want to thank you very much for sharing with us and for taking the time out of your day to present to everybody.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for the invite. I really appreciate it.